A man clocks in at a missile factory in central Russia and expects another ordinary shift. He expects fluorescent lights, bad coffee, a supervisor pretending the numbers look great, machines doing what machines do. What he does not expect is for the war to arrive before lunch. Because for most Russians living that far from the front, the war has always been something that happens somewhere else. It happens on maps. It happens on state television.
New research estimates Russian forces have suffered more than 1 million casualties in its war against Ukraine.
War in Ukraine tonight, the Ukrainian offensive inside Russia.
President Zelensky of Ukraine says that Ukraine would be open to an energy ceasefire with Russia.
It happens to soldiers, to border regions, to cities with air raid sirens and shattered windows. It is not supposed to happen here. Not this deep, not this far in, not at a place tied to the very weapons Russia uses to terrorize Ukraine. And that is why this story matters. Because Ukraine is no longer playing only at the point of impact. It is starting to reach into the machinery that creates the impact in the first place. Not just the missile in the sky, but the system that gave birth to it. The workshop, the supplier, the transport route, the fuel flow, the hidden industrial plumbing that lets Russia keep turning metal and electronics into nightly attacks. That is the real shift. This is no longer just about defense. It is about interruption. Schedules slip, security checkpoints multiply, and managers start panic buying fire extinguishers instead of meeting quotas. It's the sound of a system losing its rhythm. People begin checking the sky over places they never used to think about. That is how industrial pressure works. It doesn't always announce itself with a grand collapse. Sometimes it just starts making a powerful system behave like an aging Soviet elevator. Technically still operational. Deeply unsettling, not something you want to trust with your life. The clearest example so far is Votkinsk. In late February, Reuters reported that Ukraine said it had struck the Votkinsk Machine Building Plant in Udmurtia, a facility linked to ballistic missile production, including systems in the Iskander family. Ukrainian officials later said the attack was carried out using domestically produced FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles at a range of roughly 1,400 kilometers. This is Ukraine touching a target that was supposed to live in the safe zone of the Russian interior. The kind of place that feeds the war without feeling the war. The kind of place where people assume the front was something for other people to deal with. Now that assumption looks weaker. And that changes more than security planning. It changes psychology. For a long time, Russia's preferred model has been brutally simple. Build deep, launch deep, produce deep. Let the pain move outward while the industrial core keeps humming behind the curtain. Ukraine is trying to tear a hole in that curtain. Not by pretending one strike wins the war. Not by matching Russia shell for shell or missile for missile. That would be fantasy dressed up as patriotism. The real aim is nastier than that. Ukraine is trying to inject doubt into the production cycle itself. Factories need more than concrete walls and patriotic slogans. They need timing. They need stable inputs. They need the confidence that trucks will arrive, power will stay on, key parts will show up, workers will report for duty, and the site will not suddenly become tomorrow morning's emergency meeting. Once a plant like Votkinsk gets hit, the damage is not confined to whatever burned. The aftershock spreads through the whole ecosystem around it. Production reviews, repair bottlenecks, internal investigations, transport reshuffling, air defense reallocations, quiet panic behind official calm. And Russia has a very specific habit in moments like this. The television voice stays steady. The local bureaucracy says everything is under control. Then behind the scenes, half the country starts moving equipment around in the dark, like a landlord trying to hide a structural crack with a very expensive, very patriotic poster. That is the first break in the pattern. The second one tells you this was not random. In March, Reuters reported that Ukrainian forces struck the Kremniy plant in Bryansk, which Ukraine described as a producer of critical missile components. The reporting said Storm Shadow missiles were used, and President Zelensky called the site important to Russian missile component production. Now that target says a lot about what Ukraine is actually trying to do. A missile is not just a metal body with a warhead attached. The part that makes it dangerous is the part most people never see. Guidance systems, control units, microelectronics, the tiny unglamorous parts that decide whether a missile is a weapon or a multi-million-dollar act of self-humiliation. That is why a strike like this matters so much. A damaged warehouse is a problem. A destroyed truck is a problem. A hole in a roof is a problem. A disrupted source of specialized electronics is a different category of problem altogether. Those parts are harder to replace. And Russia is not exactly famous for stress-free procurement, even in peacetime. Give a giant wartime bureaucracy fewer options, more pressure, and a shrinking margin for error. And suddenly every missing component starts behaving like a little act of sabotage. So when Ukraine reaches a missile production site, that hurts. When it also reaches a facility tied to the electronics that keep missiles functional, the story changes. Now, this is no longer just a strike campaign. It starts looking like systems warfare. That is where the Western angle becomes important. Because the story here is not simply that Ukraine can launch more drones than before. Ukraine is building a broader long-range strike toolkit. Reuters reported that Ukrainian officials publicly tied the FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile to the Votkinsk strike, while Britain also announced Project Nightfall, a tactical ballistic missile project for Ukraine, with a stated range of more than 500 kilometers and a 200-kilogram warhead. That does not mean some magical superweapon arrives tomorrow and turns the entire Russian rear into a demolition site. Weapons programs do not work like that. Anyone over the age of 40 who has dealt with government paperwork already knows the truth. If bureaucracies could weaponize delay itself, they'd be unbeatable. What it does mean is something simpler and more serious. Ukraine's deep strike capacity is moving in one direction, up. More pressure points inside the Russian system, more reasons for Moscow to spread defenses across a much larger map. That creates a miserable trade-off. Every air defense system sent deeper into Russia covers something, but it also leaves something else thinner. Every extra layer around an industrial target admits the same uncomfortable fact. Territory that once felt secure now has to be defended like it might be next. That is expensive. That is inefficient. That is exactly the kind of burden Ukraine wants to create. And once you widen the lens, the picture gets harsher. Late in March, Reuters reported that Ukrainian strikes and related disruptions had halted at least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity. Separate reporting described attacks affecting ports such as Ust-Luga and Primorsk, alongside transport disruption and rerouting pressure. Now let's keep this grounded. That is not the same thing as saying Russia's economy has been shattered beyond repair. It hasn't. Russia still has the ability to keep fighting. But the significance of this campaign is not that it erases Russian power overnight. It is that it starts forcing Russian power to work harder for the same result. And that matters. Wars may be remembered through tanks, missiles, and explosions. They are sustained through things so boring most people never think about them until they fail. The line of locomotives that arrives on time, the depot that does not lose power, the terminal that keeps loading, the replacement part that shows up before the machine goes down, the flow of fuel that keeps every other moving piece from becoming a stationary headache. That is where Ukraine is applying pressure now. And once enough of those boring systems begin to strain at the same time, the glamorous end product starts looking less inevitable. That is the deeper meaning of this campaign. Ukraine is trying to make Russian missile strikes harder to generate before they ever happen. Harder to build, harder to sustain, harder to protect, harder to replace at the old tempo. Not impossible, just more painful. That distinction matters because it keeps the story honest. This is not a knockout punch. It is something more methodical than that. It is industrial suffocation. And from Moscow's point of view, the ugliest part is that the pressure is arriving from different directions all at once. One hit lands on production, another disturbs components, another reaches energy revenue, another complicates transport. Suddenly, the state is not dealing with one problem. It is juggling several while insisting none of them matter, which is usually how you can tell they matter very much. That is when a large military system starts looking strangely fragile. Not weak, not finished, not defeated, fragile. Because once Ukraine proves it can reach into the missile industrial base, the question changes. It is no longer, can Russia survive one strike? It becomes, how many moving parts can Russia protect at the same time before the whole machine starts losing breath? That is the part Russian planners hate. Not the optics, not the headlines, not the angry television monologues, the math. Because deep strike is no longer just a dramatic headline for the evening news. It is becoming a habit. And in wars like this, habits are what reshape the battlefield. The The real problem for Russia starts when you look at what has to happen before a missile ever leaves the launcher. Somebody has to source the components. Somebody has to move them. Somebody has to keep the power on, the trucks moving, the rail schedules intact, the depots full, the terminals functioning, the paperwork approved, the engineers showing up, and the finished product flowing toward the units that actually fire the thing. That is a lot of moving pieces for a country fighting a huge war under sanctions and trying to pretend nothing essential is exposed. That is why Ukraine is not really attacking a target. It is attacking tempo. And tempo is what turns Russian firepower from a pile of hardware into recurring pain for Ukraine. Once you understand that, the campaign starts looking less like a series of isolated strikes and more like an attempt to ruin Russia's weekly routine. Not the dramatic routine shown on patriotic TV, the real one, the grubby one, the one run by dispatchers, plant managers, transport officials, refinery staff, and tired men in offices trying to explain why everything is somehow delayed again. Because delay in wartime has a nasty habit of multiplying. It's a domino effect. One late shipment slips the schedule, one closed port backs up the rail lines, and suddenly air defenses are being stripped from the front to guard a warehouse in the rear. None of it looks cinematic, but 3 weeks later, the whole system is breathing through its mouth. And that is where logistics starts quietly turning traitor. Reuters reported in late March that at least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity had been halted by a combination of strikes, pipeline disruption, and tanker-related problems. The same period also saw disruption at key Baltic terminals, including Ust-Luga and Primorsk, with loading suspended or impaired after major Ukrainian attacks. Now that matters for money, obviously, but it also matters for movement. When ports are disrupted, when loading schedules are broken, when rail timing gets uglier, when fuel flows become less predictable, the damage does not stay neatly inside the oil sector. It starts radiating outward through transport, cost, insurance, rerouting, and timing pressure. That is how a strike on one piece of infrastructure begins annoying people who thought they had nothing to do with the original problem. And Russian systems, for all their size, do not love improvisation forever. They can absorb punishment, they can reroute, they can replace, they can bully through disruption. But every one of those solutions comes with a tax, more distance, more delay, more cost, more confusion, more strain on workers who are already juggling too much. Sooner or later, someone in the chain starts cutting corners. And in military production, corner cutting is how bad weeks become very expensive months. This is why the strike on Kremniy was so revealing. Hitting the plant in Bryansk was not just about causing visible destruction. It was about going after the kind of component base that keeps precision systems functional. Electronics are where modern weapons stop being steel and start being smart. Guidance packages do not magically appear because a procurement officer shouts at a subordinate. If those inputs get tighter, the whole production rhythm becomes more brittle. Because once the margin disappears, every future strike becomes more dangerous than the last one. Once a place that far inside Russia becomes a valid target, the map changes. Not physically, mentally. The men running those facilities now have to think like frontline people. That is a big shift. From the factory floor to the regional governor's office, the rear area has suddenly become contested territory, and that turns a country inward. Instead of simply projecting force outward, Russia now has to spend more energy protecting the plumbing behind its own force projection. That is exactly the kind of burden Ukraine wants to impose. Not because it is glamorous, because it works. And here's the unpleasant beauty of the method from Ukraine's point of view. The campaign does not need perfect success to generate strategic value. Even partial disruption can force inspections, pauses, security overhauls, movement changes, and wider caution. In other words, a strike can create a larger aftershock than the visible damage alone would suggest. That is what people miss when they watch footage of a fire and ask, yeah, but did it completely destroy the place? Sometimes that is the wrong question. The better one is, what chain reaction did it trigger? The real damage isn't the fire, it's the fact that the fire forced a security overhaul, delayed a critical shipment, and spread a quiet, industrial panic into the next facility down the road. That is how industrial warfare works in the real world. Messier than propaganda, less theatrical than action movies, far more dangerous over time. And that is where this starts feeding directly back into the battlefield. Because every delay in production, every disruption in transport, every extra cost imposed on the system, every layer of defensive effort dragged inward, all of it chips away at how comfortably Russia can sustain long-range punishment. Russia still has the capacity to strike Ukraine hard. Nobody serious should pretend otherwise. But Ukraine is trying to make that capacity progressively less smooth, less cheap, and less effortless. That is the strategic move. Not destroy everything. Not end missile production overnight. Not one strike changes the war by morning. It is nastier than that. It is forcing the Russian system to consume more of itself just to maintain the same pressure. That is how large powers start losing efficiency before they lose capability. And large powers hate that stage because it is hard to admit on television. It is much easier to point at a map and say everything is under control than to explain why the deep interior now needs guarding like a man trying to hide a steak from his own dog. It's an admission that the safe zone no longer exists. By this point, Russian planners are not just thinking about what Ukraine hit. They are thinking about what Ukraine has learned, which routes are exposed, which sectors are thin, which targets matter most, which defenses reacted too slowly, which facilities turned out to be less protected than everyone assumed. That is the truly ugly part of a deep strike campaign. It teaches the attacker while exhausting the defender, and the more often that cycle repeats, the less this looks like a handful of spectacular raids. It starts looking like a doctrine.